Sometimes the only way to survive a betrayal is to become something the world never saw coming. The night Margaux Lowe handed her cousin a glass of wine and said, "Trust me," she didn't know it would be the last thing she ever trusted anyone about. That was 3 years ago. She knows better now. The apartment they shared smelled like burnt coffee and old ambition. Margaux's had been paying 2/3 of the rent since November, covering for her cousin Betty's between jobs, stretch that had somehow lasted 7 months. She didn't mind, not exactly. She was good with money, the way some people are good at breathing. Automatic, quiet, necessary. She tracked every dollar in a notebook she kept under the kitchen sink because Betty had a habit of going through her things. She worked double shifts at a medical billing company downtown, cleaning up other people's numbers, finding the errors no one else caught. Her supervisor called her a bloodhound. Her co-workers called her obsessive. Margaux called it survival. She wasn't wrong. The night everything changed, it was raining. Not the gentle kind, the flat, relentless Chicago rain that comes in sideways and makes every street look like a crime scene. She'd worked until 9, missed the last express train, walked 6 blocks in shoes that weren't made for walking. By the time she pushed open the apartment door, she was soaked through to the undershirt and her feet were bleeding in 2 places. Bet was sitting at the kitchen table. She wasn't alone. There were 2 men with her. One was thin, pale, wearing a suit that cost more than Margaux made in a month. The other was broader, standing near the window, not quite looking at Margaux, but somehow completely aware of her. That Titular smiled. The one that didn't reach her eyes, the one that showed too many teeth on the left side. Margaux had learned to read it the way you learn to read storm clouds, too late to matter, just in time to brace yourself. "There she is," Betty said. "This is my cousin. The one I told you about." Margaux didn't move from the doorway. The thin man stood. He introduced himself as Royce. He said a name she didn't recognize, an organization she'd never heard of, and then he said something about a debt, a number, a very large number with a very specific comma placement. She looked at Bet. Betty looked at the table. "What did you do?" Margaux said. It wasn't a question. It took 40 minutes to extract the full picture from Bet, and it was uglier than the rain outside. Bet had been borrowing money. Not from banks. Banks had turned her down twice. From people who didn't use contracts, didn't use courts, and didn't use patience. She'd used Margaux's name on 2 of the agreements. Not forged. Technically. Just, she'd told them Margaux was good for it. That Margaux was her partner, her business partner in a venture that had never existed. The debt was $340,000. Royce had a very pleasant way of explaining what would happen if it wasn't paid. He used words like collateral and arrangement and reasonable timeline. He offered a glass of water while he said it, which struck Margaux's as particularly surreal. She said no to the water. She said she needed 24 hours. Royce looked at the broader man by the window. Something passed between them. He said she had until 8 the following morning. They left. Bet tried to apologize. It came out sounding like an excuse, wearing an apologies coat. Something about good intentions and bad circumstances, and you know I'd never actually let anything happen to you. Margaux picked up her dripping bag from the floor. She went to the bathroom and locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. $340,000. Her savings account had $4,200 in it. She had a 401k worth $11,000 that she couldn't touch without penalties. She had a car with 140,000 miles on it, and a laptop she'd bought refurbished. She did the math 3 times. The math didn't change. At 2 in the morning, she came out of the bathroom, sat at the kitchen table. Bet was asleep, or pretending to be, and opened her notebook. She started listing things she knew. The organization Royce had named. She'd heard it once before from a colleague at the billing company who'd processed a strange series of payments routed through a shell corporation. She'd flagged it as unusual. Her supervisor had quietly told her to unflag it. She wrote that down. She wrote down the number, the deadline, the names. Then she wrote down the only thing she could think of that wasn't running. Find out who's actually at the top. His name was Stellan Vark. She didn't find it immediately. It took 3 hours and a deep dive through corporate filings, LLC registrations, and 2 databases she technically wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. But the trail was there if you knew how to read it, and Margaux had spent 4 years reading trails like this for people who didn't know they were leaving them. Stellan Vark, 41 years old. Born in Duluth, no criminal record, which meant either he was innocent or he was very, very good. 3 holding companies, a logistics firm registered in Delaware, a real estate portfolio scattered across 6 states, and a subsidiary buried under 2 layers of shell corporations. With the same routing numbers she'd flagged 18 months ago, she stared at his name for a long time. Then she wrote him a letter, not an email. A letter, 4 paragraphs on the back of an old utility bill because she'd run out of clean paper. She outlined what she knew, what she could prove, what she was willing to do, and what she was not. She ended it with a single sentence. I am not my cousin's debt, but I am willing to work. At 6 in the morning, she walked to the address she'd traced to one of his properties, a commercial building downtown, and handed the letter to the man at the front desk, who looked at her like she'd lost her mind. She probably had. She went back to the apartment, changed into dry clothes, and waited. At 7:45, her phone rang, a woman's voice. Clipped. Professional. She gave an address and a time. Come alone, she said. Don't bring the letter. The building was on the north side of the river, glass and steel, the kind that looked like it had been designed to remind you of your own smallness. Margaux wore the only blazer she owned, which she'd bought for a job interview 2 years ago and only worn once. She'd taken the bus because the car felt wrong somehow, too much like something she might need to drive away very fast. The lobby guard took her name, checked something on a tablet, nodded once. She was escorted to an elevator that required a key card she wasn't given. The guard used his own, 42nd floor. The office she was brought to wasn't what she'd expected. No dramatic desk, no leather throne, no wall of windows with a man standing in silhouette against the skyline like a movie poster. It was just a room, neat, sparse, a table with 4 chairs, a whiteboard with numbers on it that made her stomach tighten because she recognized the structure immediately. It was a cash flow summary. And there was an error in the 3rd column that was going to compound forward by a factor of 6 over the next quarter. She was looking at it when he walked in. Vark was taller than she'd imagined. He moved, like someone who'd learned a long time ago that stillness was more intimidating than speed. He sat down without greeting her, opened a folder, and read something she couldn't see. Then he looked up. His eyes were the color of old ice. Not cold exactly, just the color that cold leaves behind after it's been there long enough. You broke into 3 private databases, he said, to write me a letter on a utility bill. The utility bill was a coincidence, she said. I was out of paper. He looked at her for a long moment. The debt, he said, is real. Your name is on it. My name was put on it without my knowledge. I'm making it between me and you, she said, because you're the one who can actually do something about it. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, nothing that soft. More like the recalibration of someone who hadn't expected to be spoken to in a particular register and was now adjusting for it. What are you offering? He said. I'm a forensic billing specialist, she said. I clean up financial trails for a living. I found yours in 3 hours with limited access and a laptop I bought refurbished in 2021. I can imagine what your actual accountants would do with a problem like that if I handed it to them. She nodded toward the whiteboard. But I also noticed the error in your 3rd column 4 minutes ago, and I haven't said anything yet, which means I know when to keep my mouth shut. He turned and looked at the whiteboard. He looked back at her. Sit down, he said. She was already sitting. Something crossed his face that might, in a different man, have been humor. She didn't go home that night. Not because she wasn't allowed. Vark hadn't imprisoned her, hadn't threatened her, hadn't done any of the things she'd prepared herself for in the elevator. He'd given her a chair, a stack of documents, and a blank legal pad, and told her she had 6 hours to tell him if there was anything worth saving. She found 4 separate points of exposure in his financial architecture that, if discovered by the wrong agency in the wrong quarter, would dismantle 3 years of legitimate restructuring and expose the underlying operations he'd worked carefully to distance himself from. 2 of them were legacy errors, someone else's sloppiness, inherited. 2 of them were recent, and she'd bet money that whoever had built those particular structures had done it with access they no longer should have had. She wrote it all out. Longhand, clear, no jargon except where precision required it. At 2 in the morning, she slid the pad across the table to him. He read it without speaking. Then he set it down and said, "Why didn't you just bring this to the FBI?" "Because then I'd have to explain how I found it," she said, "and I'm not in a position to explain how I found it." "You'd be protected. I'd be useful for exactly as long as the investigation lasted," she said, "and then I'd be a loose end. I'd rather be useful to someone who has more reason to keep me alive than the federal government does." It was the most honest thing she'd said in years. She'd been carrying it around for a long time. The knowledge that safety wasn't something you were given. It was something you built piece by piece by making yourself too valuable to discard. Vark studied her. "The debt," he said finally, "will be absorbed." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You'll work for me," he said, "on a fixed-term contract. The terms will be fair. The work will not always be legal, but it will not put you in personal danger. I don't benefit from losing good analysts. You'll have an apartment in a building I own, expenses covered, salary above what you're making now, and if I say no. Then you walk out of here, and the debt stands, and Royce finds another way to collect it." He said it without inflection, not a threat, just a fact, stated the same way you'd state weather. She thought about Bet, asleep in the apartment, or pretending to be. She thought about the car with 140,000 miles on it. She thought about the error in the 3rd column. "I'll need the terms in writing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Fair enough," he said. The first month was strange in the way that new survival always is, simultaneously mundane and terrifying. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a building near the river, clean. Modern in the way expensive things tend to be, all clean lines and absence of personality. She bought a plant immediately, a stubborn little succulent she put on the windowsill, and felt slightly better. The work was exactly what he'd described. Complex, layered, requiring the kind of careful attention she'd always given to things that other people found boring. She built clean documentation for transactions that needed to disappear. She found the holes in auditable records and filled them. She mapped the distance between what existed and what could be explained, and she drew lines around what couldn't be explained in ways that minimized exposure. She had to admit, very good at it. She saw Vark 3 or 4 times a week, always in the office, always brief. He was not warm. She hadn't expected warmth, but he was precise, and he listened when she spoke, which was more than she could say for most of the people she'd worked for. He had a habit of arriving before her and leaving after her, and she started to understand that the stillness wasn't just manner. He genuinely didn't rest in the same way other people did. He moved through the world at a different speed, slower on the surface, always calculating underneath. She learned his rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of a complicated system, first by watching, then by adjusting, then by anticipating. He started asking her questions beyond the work. Not personal, never personal, professional. What would you do if this structure collapsed under audit? How would you rebuild this if you had to start from zero? What's the weakest point in this chain? She answered, directly, without performance. Once, after a particularly long session in which she'd spent 4 hours untangling a payment chain that should have taken one, he said, not looking up from his documents, "You don't flinch." At what, she said. "Any of it." She thought about that. "I grew up with nothing," she said. "Not dramatically nothing, just quietly nothing. You learn to look at the numbers and see what's actually there. It stops being frightening once you understand the structure." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people who work for me," he said, "are afraid of me. I know, you're not." "I'm afraid of plenty of things," she said. "You're just not the most frightening thing I've had to sit across a table from." He looked at her then. She'd gotten used to that look, the recalibration. The small adjustment that happened when she said something he hadn't predicted. She didn't do it on purpose. She just didn't see the point of performing smallness for someone who could see through it anyway. The trouble with Bet arrived on a Wednesday. Margaux had half expected it. Bet had always had a talent for finding exactly the moment when things were starting to stabilize and introducing a new destabilization. She called it bad luck. Margaux had come to understand it as a kind of skill. She'd tracked Margaux to the building. Margaux didn't know how. She'd been careful. But Bet had always been better at following people than she let on. She showed up at the lobby and made a scene, loud enough that security called upstairs. Margaux went down. Bet was standing in the lobby in the kind of distress that was half real and half performance, and the ratio was something only Margaux could read. She wanted money, new money. She'd gotten herself into something else and she needed. No, Margaux said. Betty blinked. She wasn't used to the word, especially from Margaux. Margaux said, "You used my name and my credit and my reputation and you handed me a $340,000 debt and went to sleep. And I am not angry at you for being desperate. I understand desperate, but I'm done. Done," she said. "Not dead. Done. You need a lawyer, not my money. I'll give you the number of someone who can help you. That's what I can do." Betty stared at her for a long moment. "You've changed," she said. Margaux didn't argue with it. She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk. She realized her hands were perfectly steady and something about made her eyes sting briefly for a reason she couldn't quite name. Vark was in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "Problem," he said. "Handled," she said. He nodded once, slowly. Then he came in and sat down and pushed a document across the table. "New project," he said. "I want your assessment by Friday." She took the document. They didn't speak about Betty again. The thing no one tells you about building a new life in strange circumstances is how ordinary it becomes. She bought a second plant, something with broad leaves that the morning light hit well. She learned which coffee shops were open early enough for her schedule, and which security staff liked to talk, and which preferred quiet. She learned that Vark took his coffee black and hated anything with more than 3 agenda items because he'd read somewhere that the human brain processed the third priority as the last one worth full attention. She started writing her briefings in 3 sections. He noticed. He didn't comment on it directly, but he started reading them faster, and the questions he asked afterward were sharper, which she'd come to understand as his version of approval. There was an evening in November when the building had mostly emptied out, and she was still at her desk, working through a particularly gnarly series of transactions that kept resolving into the same dead end, no matter how she approached it. She was staring at the numbers, and she was aware, distantly, that she was exhausted in the specific way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the sustained effort of not letting yourself be defeated by a thing that was almost but not quite beatable. She heard him come in. He sat down across from her, which he didn't usually do unless they were working together. He looked at her papers. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "The dead end isn't in the transaction. It's in the counterparty registration. The company doesn't exist the way it's supposed to exist." She looked at the papers, looked back at him. He turned one of the pages around and pointed. She saw it. Immediately. The registration date was 4 months after the first transaction it was supposedly party to. A company couldn't be party to a transaction before it existed, which meant someone had backdated the registration, which meant there was a paper source somewhere with the real date, which meant, "There's a leak," she said. "Yes, and you knew, I suspected. Since when?" "Since before you arrived," he said. "I needed someone who would find it without knowing they were looking for it. If you'd known, you would have found the conclusion, not the trail." She sat back. "That's why you hired me, that's one reason," he said. She waited. He didn't elaborate immediately. He turned another page. He said, "You would have made a terrible investigator," she said. "I don't like not knowing things. I'd have burned every source I had in a week trying to get the full picture." "Yes," he said, "but you'd have the full picture." There was a quality to the silence after that. Not uncomfortable. Something else. The kind of quiet that happens when 2 people have been occupying the same space long enough that the silence has started to feel like a conversation. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. She said, "The leak. Is it handled? It will be by morning," he said. She nodded. She went back to her papers. He stayed where he was, working through something on his own device, and neither of them mentioned that he was still there 2 hours later when she finally gathered her things to leave. The confrontation with Royce happened in February. She didn't seek it out. He found her in the parking structure after a late session, which told her he'd been watching the building, which told her he either didn't know or didn't care that she was now working directly for the man he ultimately answered to. He said the original debt terms were non-negotiable. He said her arrangement with Vark didn't clear the personal liability. He said some other things that she stopped listening to because she was busy noting the position of the security camera, 6 feet to her left, and calculating the likelihood that this conversation was already being recorded by people who would care very much about what Royce was saying. She said, "You should call the office." "I don't work for." "You should call the office," she said again, "right now, and ask about the account flagged under Royce Leonard, the one with the third-party transfer dated October 14th. Ask whoever picks up what's been done with that account, and then decide whether you want to continue this conversation." He stared at her. She waited. He took out his phone. He made a call. She watched his face change, the kind of change that happens when a person realizes the ground under them has been quietly replaced with something that isn't ground. He left without another word. He hung up, stood in the parking structure for a moment, in the specific silence of a thing that was over. She went back upstairs. Vark was still in the office. He looked at her when she came in. "Royce," she said. "I know," he said. "How long?" "Long enough," he said. "The account has been frozen since last week." He just didn't know. "You were waiting to see how I handled it." He didn't answer. She sat down. "You could have told me," she said. "You handled it," he said. It was the closest he came to saying she'd passed something. She understood the language by now. She said, "Is there anything else you've set up for me to handle without knowing I'm handling it?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Not anymore," he said. The night she understood what she'd become was a Thursday in March. She was in the middle of a briefing with 3 of his senior people, men who'd been in the organization for years, who'd been skeptical of her from the beginning, who'd expressed that skepticism in the particular way powerful men express skepticism of women who don't behave the way they expect, through a kind of deliberate looking past, a way of directing questions through her and toward someone else. They'd stopped doing it somewhere around January. She wasn't sure exactly when. Now one of them, Harwick, who was the most senior and had been the most skeptical, was asking her a direct question about the vulnerability she'd found in their Eastern accounts. She answered. He nodded, made a note, looked at her like a person he was actually looking at. She finished the briefing. The room cleared. Vark stayed. "You know," he said, 3 months ago Harwick asked me privately if you were a liability. What did you say?" "I told him to wait 3 months," he said. She gathered her papers. "And now," she said. "Last week he told me you were the sharpest person in the building," Vark said. "Including himself." She stopped gathering papers. "He said that." He did. She thought about all the years of making herself small enough to fit through the door, keeping the notebook under the sink, working the double shifts, finding the errors no one caught, being useful to people who forgot to be grateful. She thought about Betty's face in the lobby. She thought about the utility bill she'd written the letter on. "I should finish the Eastern account documentation," she said. "It can wait until morning," he said. She looked at him. He said, "Have you eaten?" She had, in fact, not eaten. She'd been in the office since 7, and it was nearly 10. "No," she said. "There's a place that's still open," he said. "The kind of place that's used to people who work late." It wasn't an invitation, exactly. It was a statement with a door in it. She said, "Give me 5 minutes." He nodded. She went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Same face. Same eyes that had been looking at numbers since she was 17, and figured out she was better at this than anything else. Same woman who'd sat on the edge of a bathtub at 2 in the morning with $4,200 and a problem she couldn't math her way out of. Except, she stood differently. She noticed. She hadn't noticed it happening. She'd stopped bracing. They walked 6 blocks in the March cold, which was still the Chicago cold, nothing gentle about it, and went into a place that was warm and dim and smelled like garlic and old wood. They sat across from each other at a small table, and a woman who knew Vark by name brought them food without being asked. They talked for 2 hours, not about work, or not only. They talked about the city, about the way numbers tell stories that people don't intend to tell. He said something about his father's business, decades ago, the legitimate one, the one that had failed, the one that had left him understanding certain things about how the world actually worked versus how people liked to think it worked. She told him about the billing company, about the colleague who'd processed the strange payments, about the supervisor who'd told her to unflag it, and how she'd understood in that moment that there were whole systems operating parallel to the one she thought she was living in, and that she could either be afraid of that or decide to understand it. "And which did you choose?" he said. "Both," she said, for a while, and then mostly the second. He looked at her in the candlelight, the real kind of looking, not the assessment she was used to. She thought about what Bette had said. "You've changed." She hadn't changed. She'd just stopped pretending to be stay. "Passed the contract?" He paused. "Am I?" he said. "Yes," she said, "because you're practical and I'm useful and you don't let go of things that work. But I want to know if that's the only reason." The silence stretched. He said, "No." She waited. "It is not the only reason," he said. "But I don't." He stopped. He started again. "I'm not someone who—" "I know what you're not," she said. "You don't have to tell me what you're not." He looked at her. "What do you want?" he said. She thought about the succulent on the windowsill, the second plant with the broad leaves, the notebook she'd started keeping on her desk instead of under the sink. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have to, because I'm choosing to. Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference." He was quiet for a long time. "I understand the difference," he said. She believed him. Outside, the March wind was doing what March wind does in Chicago, persistent, indifferent, cold with the memory of winter still in it. Inside, it was warm. She picked up her fork. "There's an error in the February settlement accounts," she said. "I found it this afternoon. I'll have a solution by end of week." "Of course you will," he said. It was the most natural thing he'd ever said to her, the most certain. She didn't look up from her plate, but she was smiling. She'd built something here, piece by piece, number by number, in a world that hadn't asked her to come and hadn't expected her to stay. She'd made herself too valuable to discard. She'd made herself indispensable, and somewhere between the utility bill letter and the candlelit table in the dim restaurant on the north side of the river, she'd stopped surviving. She'd started belonging.